Hello to all our listeners, and welcome to another episode of the Jewish People Podcast. I'm Sam Hyde, taking over the reins of host today for Yaakov Katz, who's away on a much-deserved break. And I'm very happy to be here with you all because we have a current and interesting topic to discuss, which surrounds the 2024 Olympics that are currently underway in France. Now, if we look back, just as a little introduction to this topic and where things stand, since the 1972 Munich Games, where Israeli Olympians were taken hostage and killed by Palestinian terrorists, Team Israel has required close protection by the Israeli Security Agency. And at the start of the Games, Israeli Foreign Minister Israel Katz issued a warning to the French authorities about an Islamic Republic of Iran-backed plot to attack Israeli athletes. And this is all happening as rhetoric and activism against Israel, very mobilized within matches and outside the stadiums, heats up because of the ongoing war with Hamas in Gaza. Israel's the only national team with an extra round-the-clock security detail provided by the host country, France, and right out of the gate, we've seen protests against Israel and the Israeli team, and nearly every day there seem to be more constant threats issued against Israeli athletes. I first sat down with David Weizmann, the co-founder of Follow Team Israel, a page devoted to sharing the stories of Israeli sports with the world. And it's developed at this point into a community of over 100,000 people. So I'm really looking forward to discussing this particular topic with David and gaining some insights into the sports world, how it relates to Israel today at the Olympics, and his experiences of what Israeli athletes are going through. Then I discuss this issue as it pertains to the grand scheme of things. What is lying behind the protests, the anti-Semitism that we witness, how this relates to the basic impulses of Palestinian politics, with Dr. Adi Schwartz, a researcher and author focusing on issues relating to the Arab-Israeli conflict. Adi is also the co-author, together with Dr. Einat Wolf, of The War of Return, who's been a recurring guest on our show. Our conversation expands beyond the Olympics and the protests. And let's go. David, thank you so much for joining me. It's wonderful to have you with us at JPPI. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. It's a pleasure for having me.
Yeah, fantastic. Look, I'm no expert in sports. I'm very happy to have you here. Start just with telling us about Follow Team Israel, about your page and your community, what made you start it, the importance of it, and yeah, just the basics of that.
Sure. So I actually started 12 years ago ahead of the London Olympics. Um, because, as you know, a lot of the sports that are played at the Olympics, people don't really talk about them or cover them or know anything about them, heading into the Olympics. And so basically you have this situation where suddenly people have become like experts in Taekwondo or cycling or gymnastics, and sort of these athletes seemingly spring out of nowhere. They're given a lot of attention for a short amount of time, and then they sort of go back to obscurity.
Mhm.
Um, so we wanted to change that and basically, just say that the Olympics is part of their story, but they're competing month after month all over the world, and really, we want to support our athletes no matter what sport they're playing, uh, young, old, boy, girl, man, woman, whatever it is, like we don't care who they are. We're going to support them. And because of that, there's been an incredible outreaching of support for the page. It's one of the few places you can get non-political content about Israel. This was always, unique, but became sort of more critical since October 7th, when people maybe wanted to read news about Israel that was an outlet or an escape. Yeah, and we just have amazing support from all over the world. We have over 100,000 followers now.
Well, that's fantastic. I mean, I think it's great that you're able to bring people into a part of Israeli society, into a part of Israeli culture, that is away from, the thousands and thousands of articles that people are reading that seem to focus solely on the war and the situation that's happening. Of course, I know you said the page isn't political, but we are going to discuss a little bit of the political element of things today because it's almost unavoidable with what's
Mm.
happening at the Olympics. Um, if I'm not mistaken, I read that the French, the hosts in France, have had to actually supply a 24-hour security detail to the team. Now, obviously, this isn't political because we're speaking now about these players as these individuals and these teams that you've followed so closely. What has been the talk among the sports community within Israel, those following the Israeli team, with regards to the anti-Semitism? We've seen Palestinian demonstrations, even within soccer matches. I saw a video the other day of Palestinian protesters, doing the Heil Hitler salute at the game while the anthem, while Hatikva was playing. What has been the talk of the town within the sports world?
Right, so that's a very interesting question. Um, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. First of all, just away from the Olympics, if some Israeli is playing some random tennis tournament in like Spain, and no one knows about it, but yet they become like an ambassador of sorts. And so, thankfully, you know, by like most of like they come away unscathed, but like you never know. And the ironic thing of the situation is that no one would care about the tennis tournament. No one's reporting about it. But if there was an incident and a scandal, I mean, you could be sure it would make news around the world. And suddenly it would be like a tennis tournament in Spain, Israeli player, blah, blah, blah. Right. So that's the interesting thing, that no one actually cares about the tennis. But if something happened, it would be a situation. So that they always have to be mindful of it. Now, when you get to the Olympics, right, obviously there's global attention of it. We're all sadly familiar with what happened in 1972 at Munich. And because of that, like, never again we're very adamant about it. And so the security for every Olympic team since 1972 has been always that they've been given far greater security than what any other team has. Now, obviously, in the current climate, this is even amplified even more so,
Yeah.
and the fact that it's in Paris, you know, even more so, right, in the heart of Europe. And
For
so,
their own accounts, yeah, as well.
and, and so basically, they have to be extremely vigilant. Now, it turns out that video that was released on the eve of the Olympics with someone wearing a keffiyeh over their head was like Russian produced. And, we don't know with AI and all of this, like who's making up things and threats. But
Of course.
basically, they have to be, very careful. It's interesting because they just had the women's triathlon, and the men's was postponed yesterday, and it's going to be actually starting in like an hour or so. And so the thing is, this isn't in like a stadium where you have to go through like a metal detector,
Yes.
and it's very regulated. This is on the streets. Now they're running around the streets of Paris. Who knows what could happen. And the same thing happens with the marathon, right? When they're running around in the open. Like, but again, like
Yeah,
are
how
these
do you
things.
control that actually? Yeah, that's far more that's far greater task.
So we don't know. Like, I think what would happen was that if they want to make a statement by doing that, like I think they're all about the optics and what we've seen in Gaza and whatnot. They want to have like the images of saying like they killed babies and they did this and they did that, and that's how they gain sympathy. If they would
Yes.
actually like do anything to an athlete in broad daylight when the whole world's watching. And again, to go back to my example about some random tennis tournament in Spain, if that would make news, how much more so would something at the Olympics make news? I mean, it would be unforgettable, and basically they would lose all the world's sympathy. And basically, so I think that's probably the only thing, hopefully, that's
Yeah.
holding them back.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you have any finger on the pulse if some of these protests are coming from within the sports community, or do they seem to be outsiders, essentially, who are attending these events in protest?
I think a lot of it's outside. external forces rent a crowd. I mean, just
Yeah.
to sort of give you an example. So last year, the World Youth Football Championships were meant to take place in Indonesia. And it just so happened that in that edition, Israel qualified. And so
Okay.
at the time that Israel qualified, like the Indonesian sports minister was like, we gave guarantees to FIFA that, we'd be gracious hosts and whoever qualified, we would put up and there wouldn't be any problems. Okay, fine. So I think that was like in the summer of 2022, right? When we
Mhm.
get closer to the tournament, I think when they were having the tournament was meant to be last summer 2023, and they were doing the draw where basically they take the teams and they decide which teams are in which group and play each other. I think that was in March. And I think basically around then, a lot of people woke up, right? And were suddenly like, oh, this tournament is happening here and Israel's coming. What? And so
Yes.
basically, if you Google and you see pictures, it appears that they had like rent a crowd of old ladies with placards and signs saying like no Israel. Like they basically arranged people. These were the images that looked like it was a mass protest. And basically, to cut a long story short, they wouldn't guarantee Israel's safety, and the tournament was actually stripped from Indonesia and went to Argentina. And I think, Israel actually did very well, finishing third place, and they beat Brazil
That's
on the
always
way.
good.
Yeah, but I think with a lot of these things, people don't know, and then like one person who sort of says, "Oh, there's a tennis tournament happening, and there's an Israeli tennis player. Like, let's mount something, let's organize something, and it's basically like these people couldn't care less about tennis. They didn't even know like 2 minutes beforehand it was happening. They want to mobilize, it's all for the cameras, it's all for the optics. But like, and I think there was a similar element to that with the college protests we saw, across America and the world, that basically there is this element of like, rent a crowd, so to speak.
Yeah.
Um, and that's what happens because it's all very unfortunate. And the worst part about it, we know about athletes from certain countries. They're not allowed to participate against Israel, right? And they have to boycott. We've already had an instance of this in this
Mhm.
Olympics with an Algerian judoka basically disqualifying himself by being over the weight. Now imagine like you've trained your whole life for this. You have sacrificed so much. It's your dream to go to the Olympics. It just happens that you were drawn to face an Israeli opponent, and now they tell you you have to disqualify yourself. Like how devastating that would be to you that your life's like dream has basically been sabotaged for like political purposes and you've become a pawn. Now the interesting or ironic thing about this that they sort of fail to grasp is that it would be so valuable to them if their like Iranian athlete actually played against an Israeli one and won. I think like they could like celebrate that like they've won a gold medal and say like we beat the Zionists and we did that. Like look
Yeah,
how bad.
exactly. Well, what they're doing is actually classic anti-Zionist politics, right? It's incredibly self-destructive, and it's always been. I mean, it's
Right.
just a symbol of that. Something I found very powerful was the swimming team with the bring them home at the end. But equally, I was rather upset to see that the Israeli team. Now, I know the Olympics have a policy of no politics. Um, but what stood out to me is how the Israeli team were not allowed to wear the bring them home symbol, or but the Palestinian team was wearing shirts with supposedly Israeli planes dropping bombs. Um, I'm wondering if you can speak to that, both of those moments, the kind of silent protest at the end of some of the performances, at the end of some of the events of the Israeli team, saying "bring them home" or doing the ribbon sign in the pool, and contrasting that to it not
Right.
being officially allowed, and yet the actual official Palestinian wear for the opening ceremony was military planes dropping bombs.
So I'll answer the second part first. I think with that, that's probably an example of like don't ask for permission. Like just do it after the fact. Probably what happened was the Israelis asked and were told no. The Palestinians just did it, right? Who's going to stop them? They were on these boats anyway, so the whole thing was different. So that I think that was probably the issue. With a lot of these things, yeah, the IOC is very sort of protective of its brand, and therefore, if you if you ask anything, you can bet probably the answer is going to be no. Um, with the other stuff, there's actually been a lot of videos been going around with gymnasts and other things that people actually say is from the Olympics, but it's not the case, you know.
No,
And so,
so
but with that, I will say that, a lot of the athletes, given that they're young, early 20s and whatnot, they know people who've been affected and who died in war and all that. And we can't even imagine to understand the pressures that they're going through, even if like even if none of this was happening and everything was normal, they'd still be under a lot of pressure as an
of course.
athlete. So it's like again amplified by like 100. And the thing is like, they're in the Olympic Village, having breakfast, and someone says, like, free Palestine or River to the Sea, you know, that like can affect your whole day. And then like when you're like competing, it's still in your head. Like we don't know what they're going through. We can't even imagine. So it's very difficult for them even more. So, this is sort of like the culmination of 4 years of hard work, sacrifices and all that. And obviously since October 7th, it's been even more, difficult for them. Um, so yeah,
Yeah, I
it's
when I look at, because this is obviously in the last few months, we also had Eurovision with Erin
yeah,
Bolan. And I mean, she went through a hell of a time, but I think in that case, and I'm interested to see, is it the same with other athletes? I watched an interview with her, and she spoke about not being fully aware of that huge protest outside. She also spoke about getting booed while she was on stage, and how it kind of gave her this element of resilience and pride within being Israeli. Um, but she did say one of the hardest things for her was that among her peers, among the other competitors, and this was quite public, they were very vitriolic towards her.
yeah.
Have we seen that from actual, besides for the example that you gave of, a government not allowing their athletes to play against teams? What is the environment like between the actual sports teams and this
Right.
and the athletes? Has there been any news on that front?
So again, there was one instance that was public that was again in the judo with the judoka from Tajikistan. He defeated the Israeli opponent and he said Allahu Akbar after he won, then wouldn't shake hands. But it has an interesting postscript in that his next match, he dislocated his shoulder and was basically carried off in pain. And so people were talking about karma. With a lot of these other things, like we just don't know. Like if it's like
Yeah,
swimming, they're like in the room before the swimming, and again, someone says something or they say something under their breath. Like we're not going to know about that. But
at least not now. At least not
yeah,
now.
yeah, and so yeah, I mean, and you also have from the crowd. The crowd can shout stuff as well, and
No, it
yeah,
must be immensely difficult. One sport that I have traditionally followed was football, and I'll never forget Marcus Rashford of the Man United team. He missed a penalty, and the crowd went absolutely ballistic at him, and
at
then
the
but after
Euros.
yeah, and there was no, this was a few years ago,
Oh, okay.
and there was a lot of racist
Yeah, in the
chant.
final, in the Euro final,
Ah, was it in the Euros?
yeah,
Okay. And he spoke about that feeling for him afterwards, and I can only imagine that the Israeli athletes are going through something similar like that as we speak.
yeah,
Anyway, David, I wanted to thank you so much just for coming and giving us a little bit of insight into Follow Team Israel, as well as what you guys are doing. Thank you so much. I looked through the page and your community. I really enjoyed it. It was fantastic to learn about these sports, which I have very little knowledge of. and the players, and just keep that up. And hopefully we see Team Israel do as well as they possibly can at the games and only prosper from here on out.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Adi Schwartz, welcome and thank you for joining me and the Jewish People podcast.
Thank you for having me.
I find it so interesting that this is actually the first time we're meeting, given that we've both worked so closely with Einat Wolf, your co-author on The War of Return.
That is true.
Yeah, I want to get started and cracking on something pertaining to something happening in this moment, which is the Olympics.
Right.
The other night we saw something very interesting: protests outside the Israel versus Mali soccer match, outside the games. What I found interesting about this, because I thought, there's an ongoing war that started in 2012 between northern parts of Mali and southern parts of Mali. And it's been a brutal war with vile human rights abuses. Yet the protesters who are supposedly anti-war were just there protesting the Israeli team. Now, look, I don't know if this is just because they're unaware of the war in Mali. I wouldn't put that past some of them. Or perhaps it's a larger cynical theory at play, which is worse than troubling, dehumanizing, in fact. It seems to be this, that on the back of Israel lies a moral popularity contest, essentially, and where Israel's being treated as a pariah state. It's not something new. I mean, we saw this at the Eurovisions with Eden Golan, and of course we've seen it on the encampments across the Ivy Leagues and the streets across Europe and America. But I wanted to get your take on this moment. Well, what do you think we're witnessing here?
So yes, if you look at the last couple of months, there were rumors or reports which were actually denied even by the United Nations about some kind of a famine in Gaza and the streets of London, and of course, as you mentioned, encampments in American campuses, and actually even the vice president just mentioned, Kamala Harris just said that many people are, facing catastrophic famine, etc., even though the United Nations itself said that they have no evidence for that. However, at the same time, the last couple of months, we know that there is actual famine in areas in Africa, for example, in Sudan, war ravaging. The number of casualties is much higher. And by the way, it appears even on the front pages, or at least on the pages of the newspapers. So if you want to know, you can know it. And other protests, all the streets of London are full every weekend with stop the famine in Sudan, etc. No. So I completely agree with you that when it comes to the Jews, and in that sense, it's interesting because the whole idea of Zionism was to somehow solve the problem of the Jews. They said, okay, you don't like us, right? You don't want us near you. We got the message, loud and clear. We're leaving, okay? Just let us have our own piece of land somewhere far away from you. That was when they thought that they were talking to the Christians, right, in Europe.
Yeah.
And, no problem. We won't see you. You won't see us. Perfect. And now, for all kinds of reasons, right, it became that the Jewish state has somehow taken the role of the Jew of the diaspora. So whenever it comes to the Jews, something has to be sinister. So famine in Sudan, it's Africa. We don't really care. But when it's the Jews, then it's something else. So yes, I completely agree. I think that the level of cynicism and we can call it what it is. It's anti-Semitism, and sometimes people think, oh no, it can't be. We're 2024. People are so open and cosmopolitan, and everybody. We don't care if you're black or white or transgender or whatever. But I tend to be, how should I say it? Less optimistic. And the war, World War II, right, with the gravest, most horrible performance, let's say, of anti-Semitism in World War II ended in 1945. But do we really think that something very deep in people's psyche changed that day. So yeah, some people said, okay, yeah, it's really not nice to kill Jews. Some people, I believe, really, understood what went on. But many people, they just know that they should not be anti-Semitic out loud because that's not allowed anymore. That's not politically correct. But
So
then they can
waiting a call
say,
to action, essentially.
exactly. So they can say the Jewish state.
Hmm.
Anyway, it's full of Jews, so it's kind of tricky. I
Yeah,
definitely, yeah.
no, sorry, carry on.
No, I definitely think that it's not about the John Doe who's just going on his business, and I imagine that they don't know much. And if you watch the CNN and the BBC, then they of course bombard you with so
Yeah.
many news about Israel. So you can be forgiven if you don't know what's going on in Sudan. But these people who are supposed to be political and Congress members like Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, they certainly know what's going on in Africa, or they can. They're certainly being briefed on that, etc. So it's not a coincidence. It's not a question of not knowing what's going on. It's unfortunately um, part of life, something the Jews carry with them that they won't leave us alone very easily.
Yeah, well, I think it's become more and more obvious to me, and I think to many people, that anti-Semitism is really the core tenet of the Palestinian movements that galvanizes support. I mean, that's for sure. There's, as you mentioned, there's no sort of turnout for Darfur, Tibet, or Sudan, and yet, even if there is concern about these cases, they certainly do not elicit week after week, month after month across continents this impassioned activism. And they certainly do not thrive, which is, I think, what unites all these different groups, the communist social justice warriors, Islamists, neo-Nazis. They're all united behind this, one perceived enemy that supposedly is responsible for their own suppression and killing children for sport in a foreign land. So I definitely see what you mean there, and I'm always struck by how easy it's been for people to look at the Charlottesville riots, for example. White supremacists with tiki torches shouting, "Jews will not replace us," and then seeing after October 7th. Hamas is coming, spray painted on monuments, death chants in Arabic and their euphemisms in English, calling for intifadas, and somehow turn around and feel that, there's some sort of level of apology that they can get away with on these protests. It's not like there's been one or two incidents here. I mean, it's happening at every single protest. And sure, I'm not saying that every single protest of the tens of thousands that are turning out is a virulent anti-Semite, but they surely are engaging with it, and it surely is a factor that is mobilizing their turnout. But I want to bring us back because we started with the Olympics, and I think if we look back to 1972, because this will touch on some stuff in your book, The War of Return, with Dr. Einat Wilf.
Right.
The Munich massacre, Black September, the Palestinian faction responsible for the captivity and the ultimate death of Israeli Olympians, they were products of UNRWA. And I find over the last few months that conversation has really come to the fore after October 7th. And I think your book with Einat was really ahead of its time in the argument that it was making. But I just, for the listeners, just want you to get a bit of a broad perspective on how you see UNRWA, because I see the relationship between UNRWA and Hamas, let's say, as far worse as just kind of this partnering. I think UNRWA is its own intergenerational infrastructure that keeps the war against the Jewish state alive. It's not just aiding and abetting a terrorist organization. It's got its own separate cynical role at play here. And I think that's what most people, I think even the people aware of UNRWA's role in October 7th don't kind of get to that point, which is that UNRWA is not just, engaging with Hamas and aiding Hamas. They are themselves responsible for not only perpetuating the conflict, but being, I don't know how else to put it, but a conveyor belt, a supply chain of terrorism.
Exactly. And I agree that this is something that we haven't fully, I think, been able to convey the message, because everybody understands, oh, once again, UNRWA school or an UNRWA teacher was found to be involved in terror. Yes, of course they were, but the problem is much bigger, you know? So I completely agree with what you're saying. So just very shortly to explain, UNRWA was invented in 1949 by the United States mainly, with the view, just as they did with the Marshall Plan in Europe. They said, okay, we had a war. This is a devastated area. People were dispossessed, whatever. We don't care why it happened. We don't care actually who's right. But now we have a problem. And they thought that this is a very American view, that if people are, they don't have houses, they don't have jobs, they don't have money, this is a source for political instability, and we have to solve it. So they had to put a lot of money. They thought that in 18 months, okay, meaning 1.5 years, that it will be over, and they can take care of about a million Palestinians. And by that, I mean finding them shelter in the sense that, permanent housing and new jobs. And they had it planned out. By the way, if you're interested, that was the idea was, kind of like the New Deal. Some of the people were, it's not that back far after the 30s, right? So they thought that the way forward is what they did in the 30s. The only problem is that the population that they were dealing with, meaning the Palestinians, had no intention whatsoever to continue with their lives. That was not the purpose. The Palestinians from day one, and this is also something that people forget or tend not to understand, they did not want to be resettled. They did not want to get new jobs, new houses, because for them, that would mean the betrayal of their dream. So the Palestinian worldview, and by the way, of most of the Arab world, certainly then, but actually even today, is that the entire land is theirs. What has been the British Mandate of Palestine, what we call in Hebrew Eretz Israel, everything should be Arab and Muslim. This is why they rejected each and every partition plan. They said, no, even a small part of the land, nothing for the Jews, everything for the Arabs. So for them, it's a huge injustice. When you tell them, okay, but there was a partition plan in 1947, blah, 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 they say, we don't care. It's the justice of the Europeans. It's the justice of the imperialists. We were here, we were Arab, Muslims, everything is ours. So for them, moving forward with all these beautiful words and money of UNRWA and the Americans was simply, not interested. And if we move a little bit, then UNRWA was on the brink of closing down. The Americans said, okay, they don't want to cooperate. They wrote back and forth from Washington and London, and they said, we don't see any point in this. They don't want to cooperate. Let's close down UNRWA. And that is the moment in the 50s when the Arab world, the Arab countries, turned UNRWA into a political agency. They told the Americans, listen, and remember, this is the height of the Cold War, when the Soviets are just trying to intervene and look for those holes in the whole Middle East. Arab countries told the Americans, no, you're not going to close down UNRWA. UNRWA is an asset. We want UNRWA to stay. And this is a political agenda. This is a political organization. This is our way to not have, or to not resettle, to not solve our problem with the Jews. Now, remember, this is time when we don't have settlements. This is the 50s. We don't have settlements. We don't have occupation.
Yes.
We don't have the West Bank, not Gaza, nothing. So what is the most visible, the most tangible claim that the Arabs can have against the Jewish state? The refugees. So why should they solve them? They say explicitly, we're not going to solve it. And then UNRWA turns into, by the end of the 50s, most refugees are not really refugees in the sense that we understand. They have permanent house. That's back in the 50s. They have permanent housing. They eat well. You know that already in 1952, there are reports by the Ford Foundation saying that Palestinians have better quality of life than they had before 1948, meaning before the war, and certainly better than many other people in the Arab world. Okay? So humanitarian issue was done by 1952. But you can't close down UNRWA because the Arabs will be angry and they might, use the oil, the whole issue. And that is the moment when UNRWA turns into this massive tool. You could say it's like an extra state or a womb or an enabler of an entire Palestinian ethos and narrative. And sometimes people say, okay, you know what? No big deal. So they build them houses, they build them schools, they build them infrastructure. That's a good thing.
Yes.
Yes, the question is, what was the content? And here again, you go to the 1972. What's interesting about 1972, if you look at the chronology, this is the first time newborns that were born in, let's say, 1948, 1949, just after the war. This is the coming of age. This is the first age. They're about 20, 25, right? In the 1972 Olympics. This is the first generation that was actually born, brought, and taught and educated in UNRWA schools. So this is the outcome, This is the jewel in the crown. This is what they achieved.
I worked for an institute prior, and we did some research into their textbooks, and I saw, just obviously the textbooks are Palestinian Authority textbooks, but they taught in UNRWA schools, and they have their own self-created teaching materials as well. Peace seen as a sign of weakness, the glorification of jihad and martyrdom. Now, obviously, UNRWA is the actual political infrastructure that keeps this dream alive. And yet, despite the fact that the Biden administration have subsequently, after October 7th, defunded, which is a bit of an autocorrect button, seeming it was by the previous administration defunded, and yet they went ahead and funded it prior to October 7th. But it seems, I was looking at, Vice President Kamala Harris's speech the other day. I was listening to it. And look, I understand it was a short speech. She probably wasn't trying to lay out the whole proposal, but there was no mention of how they plan on getting rid of Hamas. There was a mention of bringing back the hostages, which is obviously of vital importance to Israeli society, and of rebuilding Gaza. There was, what you're speaking to, you mentioned the Marshall Plan. I mean, if I'm not mistaken, the Palestinians have received over the years 4 times, inflation accounted for, the amount of money for building and rebuilding processes. And yet it constantly seems that the core issue is ignored. So it's essentially, we're doing a rebuilding effort that is just setting the stage for another rebuilding effort, as long as we ignore the infrastructure and the ideologies that are driving this. But it does bring me on to another question that I actually was very interested to get your take on, because after October 7th, I've thought a lot about it, and I've thought, all right, this is obviously not just a simple national territorial conflict. There's obviously underpinnings here that go far deeper. It's probably more civilizational, in the sense of Zionism is seen as a significant threat to Arab dominance in the region. And the issue is more so with sovereign Jews than any sort of border. I stumbled across an interesting text by a guy named Rashid Rida, who was an Egyptian theologian, and he wrote a letter to the Arabs of Palestine in late 1800s, at the time of the Islamic renewal. And it was not a polite letter. He called them complacent nothings. And the argument that he was making, and just to contextualize it, he so happens to be the teacher of Haj Amin al-Husseini and Qassam, who Hamas's brigades are obviously named after. And he makes the claim to them that he said, this is theologically unjustified. We can understand being pushed back by the British Empire, but we are currently in the process of asking ourselves, why has Islam become weak? And you want to get pushed back. You're going to allow the weakest of all weak, the people who have been pushed out of every country, the people who are being pushed out of Eastern Europe and who are arriving at New York with not even $1 in their pocket. You're going to be pushed back by them. So he makes the claim at that point. And it seems to be in the kind of intellectual realm at the birth of the Palestinian National Project to be far more of a theological and civilizational issue. I'm wondering how much you think that is still a part of the conflict, and how much ignoring that issue that's lying probably at the core, at least the birth of this problem, is contributing to the continuation of this, meaning for as long as any rebuilding effort ignores the ideology and is just focused on we need to rebuild here and we need this amount of money, there's clearly no shortage of resources given what we've spoken about. But as long as we're ignoring this broader ideological base of what actually rests at the heart of the conflict, it doesn't seem like there's any actual way of solving it. So what are we doing here with regards to the American administration, who seem to be kind of, as the way you've explained it, just repeating what the decision they made in 1948 with establishing UNRWA and the subsequent rebuilding efforts? One would think after October 7th that maybe there would be some sort of shift in the consciousness of those involved, and yet it doesn't seem like we're there.
So yes, I can tell you, I've just been reading a book about the Cold War, and I saw one of the analysis that the Americans had after the World War II, which was the basics for the whole Cold War and the entire thing. Why do we have wars in the planet? Is because we didn't have, or because we don't have political equality. People want to be politically equal, and then we need to have economic stability. Once we have that, we won't have wars. I think this is a very classic American worldview. So if we can solve, this is, by the way, having a Palestinian state, right? This is political equality and some kind of economic cooperation, restructuring, rebuilding, resettling, et cetera, et cetera. So this is what the American mind is focused on. Now, in many places, it has very good results, but in places, not so well. And yes. I want to connect to something that you just said. It is true. I think it is crucial. In the classic theological view of Islam, Jews are second class. Mm-hmm. The Ummah, and in that sense, the political, what we call the body politic, belongs to Muslim men, by the way, but certainly Muslims. Christians, as well as Jews, are relegated to a second class. I can tell you that in so many instances, not only in the end of the 19th century, I have read so many examples of degrading insults. I've met a Syrian professor, now he's in his 80s, who grew up in Damascus, in Syria, in the 40s, to a normal Sunni Muslim family. And he told me that when he was a young boy and his father hit him, the mother, trying to protect him, asked the father, why are you hitting him? Is he a Jew? So this was the way, this is a kitchen talk, okay? This is not a pamphlet. This is
common refrain.
Okay, so this is how people understand. Jew is something that you can harm, that you can attack without paying a price. I have read so many examples of young boys. That was the height of humiliation, when you had dignified Jews, doctors, lawyers walking in Istanbul in the mid-19th century with their hats and mustache, you can imagine, and young boys throwing at them stones, and nothing happened. So this was, even a young boy can hit a very dignified. So in their mind, in the Muslim mind, there is a place for the Jews, which is certainly not to have an army, to have a state, to have a prime minister. So Jews are tolerated as long as they are perhaps the finance minister in an Arab country, or, they can be useful from time to time. It's a very different worldview from Christianity. Certainly not equal in the sense of, they have their own state. I think it's a crucial aspect that we have to understand.
Adi, thank you so much. Thank you for joining me at the Jewish People podcast. I really appreciate it.
We could have continued for hours.
We could have continued for hours, that's for sure. But we'll have to do it over coffee.
Okay.
Okay, Adi, thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in. You can find our episodes weekly on Mondays and Thursdays right over here, or listen later on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. Until next